Ruan, I do want to start with you. As I mentioned in your bio, you described yourself as a recovered anti-Semite who grew up in a very different environment. Can you take us into that turning point moment? What changed for you, and how has that shaped your current work in addressing anti-Semitic attitudes in the Arab and European diaspora?
Happily, thank you, Mayan, for having us. As Michal suggested, we shall speak faster. So I do identify as a recovered anti-Semite, and my Israeli friends say, "You're better than that, don't say it." But I'm not better than that, and for more than half of my life, I was an anti-Semite who hated the Jews, the Israelis, and the Zionists. And I grew up in progressive Lebanon. And no, we do not make a distinction between Israeli Zionists and Jewish. That's a farce. And I grew up similar to the many useful idiots you are witnessing today. I was a big fan of Hezbollah, although my father is Sunni from Damascus. My mom is a Lebanese Shiite from the Bekaa Valley. I already told you that I grew up in a secular family, otherwise a Shia would not intermarry with a Sunni, and they sent us to a French Catholic school. I grew up in an environment where everybody was educated, tolerant, loving. The only thing everybody hated in progressive Lebanon was the Jews, the Zionists, and the Israelis. And it was really easy for us to hate them. You would hate them as well, sir. And I will explain why, and several in this room asked me yesterday. First of all, as Sharon, who I dare call a friend, mentioned earlier, more than 800,000 Jews were uprooted from the Arab world. So when Palestinians demand of you to acknowledge their tragedy, the Nakba, let's accept their version of events. But even though, if we do, remind them that more than 800,000 were uprooted from this Arab world. So there were no Jews around me in Lebanon to contest whatever the state told us about them. Also, Israel occupied South Lebanon. This is why I was fond of Hezbollah, because they were the only heroes who dared defy the occupation. Nobody told me when I was a teenager why Israel had to create a buffer zone in South Lebanon. And the fact that Israel showed restraint for more than 10 years while Yasser Arafat and his gangsters, not only Arabs, but also from the West, maybe you know about Bader Meinhof, to give an example, they abused Lebanese hospitality, the territory, and for more than 10 years they sent men and women who targeted Israeli civilians in terror attacks. That's why Israel created a buffer zone. And only to conclude, in my mid-20s, when I moved to Europe and lived among Jews, I discovered something really important. The fact that the Jews were normal. And that made me understand how badly indoctrinated we were.
So I'm going to ask you a second question, but first we're going to play a very quick game of musical chairs, simply because this is being live streamed and we want to make sure that you're sitting under your name. So Rowan, if you will switch to Itamar's chair, Itamar's Michal's chair. Michal, come sit by me. Thank you.
With a glass of water.
With your glasses of water. And then I'm going to ask you, Rowan, to follow up.
Not to exchange germs, if we have any.
Hopefully everybody is healthy. So you have a lot of conversations about what you've discovered. You know, you have become very verbal about the misconceptions that you had. But when you speak to others who still have those misconceptions, what are the most common misconceptions that they hold, and how do you manage to correct them?
So to explain, if somebody in the crowd doesn't understand why I'm special. I'm special because I'm one of very few Arabs who can visit Israel, who want to visit Israel, and who are able to. So most of the Arab world has never, Arabs in general, have never spoken to a Jew or to an Israeli. I share with you something interesting. embedded in our constitutions and basic laws in most of the Arab world, we have the so-called anti-normalization laws and policies forbidding people-to-people contact between the citizens of those countries and Israelis, even abroad. Which means, for example, a Lebanese, a Kuwaiti, an Algerian, an Iraqi cannot speak to an Israeli, even if they meet them in a pub in London or in Sydney. And those laws and policies were implemented since the 50s, and they are designed to dehumanize the Jew, the Zionist, and the Israeli. So for me to cross on the other side of the fence, to realize that the Jews are normal, and to say out loud that our side, my side, is the aggressor, was my epiphany, but it inspired a few others. Social media, this age, allowed us to bypass those absurd laws and policies. It enabled the Arabs to understand that the Jews are normal, and it allowed the Jew and the Israeli to tell their stories, a narrative that was, prior to social media, totally omitted. My final thought that I'd like to share is that you'd be surprised how many Arabs nowadays understand that Israel is not our problem in the Middle East. Israel would not be opposed to any Arab country addressing corruption or pollution or domestic violence or unemployment. Israel has nothing to do with your problems in the Arab world, and the narrative is slowly shifting.
Incredible. Now, Itamar, I want to turn to you because you, of course, have been writing about the ideologies among the Arab world, specifically the Palestinian Authority, for decades, in fact. And you actually talk a lot about how it mirrors the Nazi regime. I'm wondering if you can go over the key ideological links and why you believe that they've taken hold in this context.
Okay, thank you very much, Maya. The reason why I've been writing about this so long is because one of the fundamental mistakes made by the international community is to define the Israeli-Arab conflict only as a function of land. Whereas if you listen to the Palestinian Authority messages, the conflict is about people. It's about Jews. And that's why understanding Palestinian Authority anti-Semitism is so critical, because if you don't know the problem, you can never solve the problem. You don't know what the problem is. What is Palestinian anti-Semitism, and why is it so similar to the Nazis? Well, there are two components of both Nazi and Palestinian Authority anti-Semitism. I'm not talking about Hamas, I'm talking Palestinian Authority. And those are how they define the Jewish problem and what's the solution to the Jewish problem. The Nazis defined the Jewish problem. The Jews were the capitalists, they were the socialists, they were the ones who were ruining life around the world. They wrote the Protocols of the Elders of Zion. Everyone was endangered by the Jews, and therefore fighting Jews was virtuous. It was ethical, it was moral, it was self-defense. Now, tragically, we're seeing all these components in Palestinian Authority ideology. They have been saying, since Palestinian Media Watch has been following the PA, they have been saying that the Jews are the world's problem. I'll give you examples from the top, because this is not the media problem, it's the leadership problem. Mahmoud Abbas has said numerous times in speeches that the Jews suffered anti-Semitism from the Middle Ages through the Holocaust. It wasn't because they were Jews, he said, it was because of their social role, because of interest, and because of other things, and this is why they were hated. They brought the hatred on themselves. He went so far last year as to say, Europe and Hitler fought Israel, he said Hitler also, not because they were Jews, but again, because of their social role. And then he said, Hitler fought the Jews because they were causing ruin. He thought they were causing ruin. It was self-defense. This is the Palestinian Authority message. In fact, they go so far as to say that's why Israel exists as a state. Israel has no history in the land. There was no Jewish state before. Why does Israel exist? Israel is the European solution to the Jewish problem. They took the Jews, they put us here, and they said, okay, this is going to solve the problem. They went so far after October 7th, when many European countries and the United States leadership came to visit Israel. They said, why are all these leaders coming to visit Israel? Israel's, of course, a pariah. Why are they coming here? And they said, because they succeeded in getting rid of the human waste. They don't want the human waste to return, and that's why Europe supports Israel. So this is, now, what did the Nazis say the solution to the world's Jewish problem is? And this I don't have to, it was extermination. The Jewish problem is so inherent. It's in their genes. It's in their essence. They have to be exterminated. This is what we've been hearing from the Palestinian Authority. I'll just give you one example. Over the last year, we have heard 7 different times on official Palestinian Authority TV from official religious figures the following expression: Allah, count the Jews one by one, kill them one by one, don't leave even one. Don't leave even one. Extermination. This is official Palestinian Authority TV, owned and controlled by the way. This is the problem. If the world doesn't recognize the centrality of Palestinian anti-Semitism to the conflict, there will never be a solution.
But Itamar, what happened ultimately in Nazi Germany, thank God, although of course we unfortunately lost so many, 6 million Jews, was that Nazi ideology was more or less eradicated. Is that something that you believe that we could do in the Palestinian Authority? Can we rid the Palestinian Authority of this anti-Semitism, and now Germany is like our closest ally in Europe? Could we see something like that happen ever here in the Middle East?
Okay, so first of all, I have to be optimistic and believe that through education and through change, that could happen. But I want to point out why changing Palestinian Authority the ideology of anti-Semitism is going to be harder than the Nazi ideology. And there are 2 reasons. First of all, Nazi ideology, the Nazi party took over in 1933. By 1945, it was over. We're talking about 12 years of indoctrination so that it wasn't so deeply ingrained. Palestinian Authority, since their inception in 1994, this has been their message to their people. So first of all, we have 3 decades of this, and it's a whole generation that has this message. The second reason, and more important, the Nazi hatred of Jews was built primarily on a secular message. The Jews are controlling this, the Jews are ruining that, capitalist, socialist, you name it. Once Nazism was defeated, the Germans had nothing to grab onto, and it was relatively easy to re-educate. The Palestinian Authority tells its people that this is Allah's definition of the Jews. Allah is the one who determined the Jews have to be exterminated. And when it's a religious belief, how do you come to people and say, well, Allah changed his mind? We changed our mind about what Allah's been saying. It is a much greater challenge until the Palestinian Authority changes its religious beliefs fundamentally. Fundamentally, there will never be a chance of peace, and that's why this challenge is so great.
Thank you for that. And Michal, you've recently taken on a new role, and I know you've been talking about anti-Semitism for decades, but I want to focus on your new role with the Legal Forum, because anti-Semitism is not just religious anymore, and it's not just about where people live and lands, but it's actually gone to the courts, to the International Criminal Court of Justice, to the ICC, and even in local or national courts in the United States. We've got a case going on right now in California, right, that we talk about. I wrote it down, AB 715, targeting anti-Semitism in K through 12, right? So what legal challenges arise when anti-Semitism takes on the form of a blood libel, but in international forums like those?
So, hi. First of all, thank you, everybody, for being here. I've spoken to some of you over the course of this week, and the most important thing for me to say is thank you for being here and for bearing witness, and actually for making clear that you intend to take back everything you've noted and witnessed here, including in order to face the denial of October the 7th that we have seen on and since October the 7th. So I'm very grateful for your being here. And the second sort of very important message that I wanted to say is that the hostage that was returned last night was identified as Joshua Malal. He was a Tanzanian agricultural student who will be brought to final rest. May his family find some blessing and comfort amongst the mourners of Zion and Jerusalem, and the understanding that there are 6 more human beings that Hamas, a genocidal terror organization, continues to hold, and it relates to Mayan's question, in egregious violation of agreements, of law, and of morality. So just to note the intersection between the issues as it brings us to law. And I want to say, and I may even disagree a little bit with Itamar on this regarding Nazi ideology. Look, anti-Semitism is the oldest hatred in the world, as Professor Wistra called it, the longest hate. It has mutated over thousands of years by latching onto the guiding social construct of each time: religion, science, and the secular religion of our times, human rights. My area of expertise, the reason that I'm responding to Mayan right now, but it has come back full circle to religion. And if we fail to identify that the intersection between the extreme right, the extreme left, by the way, they call themselves right and left. They have nothing to do with right and left, with conservative and liberal. They have nothing to do with those foundational principles of democracies. They've just entered those spaces. And by the way, with extreme Islam. The intersection is extremism. I just said the word. And anti-Semitism, as that ancient, ever-mutating hate, enables to understand, to see the extremism that threatens our shared humanity, our shared freedom, and the dignity of difference, in the words of the late Rabbi Sachs. We therefore understand that we have to identify how we arrived at this strain of anti-Semitism, and I will argue it is the law. It is the legal infrastructure. It is the international rules-based order post-World War II, created and entrusted in order to ensure those two words of never again to anyone, even as genocide right now in Sudan, to the sounds of international silence, is enabled by that impunity that has to be understood as we are about to mark 50 years to the opening blood libel of modern times, that is the Zionism is Racism resolution passed in the UN, in that institution created and trusted to uphold, promote, and protect an international rules-based order of human rights, the secular religion of our times, so that never again. We are not a race, ladies and gentlemen. Zionism, as the late Patrick Moynihan, the then US ambassador to the UN, says, Zionism may be a lot of things, but it cannot be racism. Zionism is the progressive national liberation movement that enabled Jews, a prototypical indigenous people, indigeneity of which we were stripped, including by the Palestinian Authority, the return to an ancestral homeland after thousands of years of exile and persecution that Sharon spoke about, and by the way, committed to equality, which is Israel's Declaration of Independence. The understanding that Zionism is racism was passed in that UN intentionally, actually adopting not only Nazi ideology, but the protocols of the elders of Zion, Soviet propaganda. Zionism is racism, and it is alive and well on university campuses, on social media spaces, on the streets, in the protests, and we falsely call them, and when I speak to media, I say we have to be accurate in our words. When we call those pro-Palestinian protests, we actually enable them to dictate the discourse. If they were pro-Palestinian, they'd be protesting to free Gaza from Hamas. If they were pro the people of Lebanon, they'd be protesting to free Lebanon from Hezbollah, and to free the people of Yemen from the Houthis, and to free the people of Iran from the criminal Islamic regime in Iran. But that's not what we've seen on the streets. What we've seen is Zionism as racism and cleansing the world for a Judenfrei world, as the Middle East became, by the way, with 850,000 Jews, again, that Sharon or Mayan mentioned, ethnically cleansed from Arab lands in Iran, as Rowan said, including my own grandparents from Baghdad. In which case, we're all still refugees, but guess what? We're not. None of us are refugees, only singularly Palestinians, refugees, that pass down, according to UNRWA, another display of ridiculous double standards. And so if I just come back to your question and say, Mayan, it is the law that has to be not only remembered, but reclaimed. And it is us, each individual sitting here, that has to renew the commitment to the foundational principles, to the covenant. By the way, when I speak of the covenant in this room, I need not explain the basic covenant that then served as the infrastructure of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the 10 Commandments. That is the basic covenant. That is our shared responsibility. And that is what we need to renew the commitment to, so that all of our spaces and places in which anti-Semitism has become normalized, and that's the bad news, Anti-Semitism is the new normal and the very old normal if you utilize the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance definition to identify it and to be able to understand how dangerous it is as that most reliable sign of the major threat to humanity, freedom, and the dignity of difference of all in whatever spaces it has been normalized.
Well, thank you, Michal. And of course, what we've actually seen is that anti-Semitism is no longer just rhetoric, but it's actually turning into violence. We're starting to see a lot of actual physical attacks that are happening, hate crimes that are being carried out in the streets, rising across the US and certainly in Europe as well. And that Jews are now the target of nearly 70% of religious-based crimes, even in the United States. Rowan, I want to go to you because you're living in Europe, and a lot of the Middle Eastern refugees, from what I understand, have infused a level of anti-Semitism into the streets in which you live. Talk about what you're seeing. What are the messages you're encountering, and how do we fight this so that not only the words but the violence does not continue to rise?
So after I realized how badly indoctrinated we were, I returned to the Middle East and I tried to share, at least with my family and close friends, the consequences of this indoctrination and the fact that it led to the loss of thousands of lives, and this is an understatement, all of which could have been avoided had the Arabs not adopted this entitlement attitude and claimed that the Jews stemmed from somewhere in Eastern Europe. I gave up because a lot of people find it so complex, they'd rather carry on hating Israel. And a lot of people around the world have given up on the Middle East. You can never solve this problem. So I moved back to Europe, and I've been living there for 15 years, in France, and then in Cyprus, and now for 12 years in Germany. And I've watched the continent transform. It is unbelievable. I took my only child to raise him in societies with which values I identify. I identify with modern day Germany, and I'm lucky to have lived there, to have covered that chapter of anti-Semitism as well. And I always thought at the beginning of the 12 years that it is too much in Germany, it's too intense. The only thing they talk about at schools, on TV, on the radio, is Nazi Germany. They remind every day. I've never imagined that we will reach a point where we would say all of that was not enough. Especially after 2015, after this influx of Syrian refugees, and I'm half Syrian. Of course, I'm happy to see the world take action, and the world did let the Syrian people down. And the same dictator that killed more than 500,000 obtained humanitarian asylum in Russia. The ICC issues an arrest warrant for Bibi Netanyahu because they're obsessed with Israel. Where is Assad's arrest warrant? I live in a place where Angela Merkel, meaning well, I think, said, "Wir schaffen das." We can manage and receive 1 million Syrians, initially, mostly men, and I said they're anti-Semitic and misogynistic. And I say this as a Syrian because, to start with my last point, men on the streets in Damascus, the capital city where not all women are wearing the veil, come and touch you. Come and touch you as a girl, and the policemen will not help you. They all give you the looks. If you're not veiled, you've brought it upon yourself. So that was a concern when I see 1 million coming to Europe, but also the fact that they're anti-Semitic. It started back then. And I dare say this because I bought my version of Adolf Hitler's Mein Kampf for less than $1 in Damascus. I bought the Protocols of the Elders of Zion for less than $1 in Beirut, and it is treated as a serious book, often even by academics in the Arab world. So I knew what I was talking about, and I was warning. And back in 2015, I said this will lead to an inevitable rise of the far right because people will be frustrated after hearing of incidents. And I share one incident with you. In Berlin, and I live very far from a very woke Berlin, a Syrian teenager saw a Jewish teenager. He identified him because he was wearing a kippah. And the exchange was recorded by the friend of this Jew wearing a kippah, and it went viral on social media. The Syrian only said, "You're a Jew." He's a Jew. Is he Jewish? He was shocked. And he took off his belt, and he was hitting the Jewish boy with a metal buckle on his head. And that sent shock waves in Europe when Jewish communities understood what they've invited into the continent. Similar to the shock waves the Hebron massacre back in 1929 sent throughout the Arab world, where the Jews realized those 60-plus massacred Jews have lived there for centuries, and the notables of Hebron heard the cries of women and children and let it happen. They realized your neighbors might attack you and kill your children, rape your women. So now we've come to this realization, and we're watching the repercussions of European naivete when we saw how they took over public spaces and universities. If I'm invited to tell my personal story, in the Netherlands, I needed 8 bodyguards, 8 undercover, university security, and the police, and the event had to be canceled halfway through because the mobsters destroyed public properties outside. This is our reality, and I'm afraid to say that I don't know if the Europeans will take action before it is too late, because I am a person who's contemplating leaving. Just imagine what Jewish communities in London or in Paris or in Madrid or in even Rome are feeling like.
Wow, and I wanted to be able to ask, what do we do about it? But it almost seems like we don't even know. And Michal, I want to turn to you to specifically talk about that, because what we're seeing in Europe, we're also seeing in Canada, where you're from, and of course in the United States. So talk to me about what we see in North America in comparison to what Rowan described, and is there any action we can take?
Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah. So I don't need to tell you, Zoran Mandani is now the mayor of New York City. To answer that question, is there action we can take? Where do I begin with the imperative to understand that we have to call out the modern mainstream strain of anti-Semitism if we're going to be able to do anything? Because Zoran Mamdani actually said he's committed to combating anti-Semitism. But I referred to it yesterday, shortly before, sorry, not yesterday. Anti-Semitism has a definition. The International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, in a long democratic process, enables to identify all strains of what is that thousands of year old, ever mutating lethal virus, including the mechanism that enables its mutation. Natan Sharansky's 3 Ds: demonization, delegitimization, and double standards. The understanding that it is Israel, the Jew among nations, that has been demonized, delegitimized, and applied double standards to. If I began with Zionism is racism 50 years ago, I'll continue with the Durban Conference Against Racism, in which all these human rights organizations witnessed blood libel number 2 of modern times actually take hold, as that Zionism is racism came into play in a Durban Conference Against Racism, in which it became an anti-Semitic hate fest. Because if Zionism is racism, the conference is against Zionism. And therefore, Israel is an apartheid state, peddled on that last day of the conference that became an anti-Semitic hate fest, that enabled what now is 24 years. And Rowan spoke about what happens on universities in the Arab world. But I'm talking about North American universities. Israel apartheid weeks have taken place on every single campus in North America for 24 years. That means there are 24 years of graduates who have walked through the commons and experienced what is blood libel. Israel is an apartheid state, no questions asked. And I'll say, in the most Orwellian inversion of fact and of law that is the most dangerous we have been witness in what we've seen in the last 2 years. And that is, of course, the appropriation and redefinition and hijacking and weaponization of the term genocide. Words have meaning. The term genocide, coined by Raphael Lemkin, whose entire family was annihilated in Auschwitz, to create the Convention for the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide, of which the State of Israel in 1948 is one of the first signatories, of course, having just experienced genocide, for which Raphael Lemkin termed the coin, seated in the aftermath of the October 7 massacre perpetrated by genocidal barbarians whose covenant openly calls for the destruction of the State of Israel and murder of Jews, Mein Kampf. Literally in the charter of Hamas and Hezbollah and the Houthis and, of course, the genocidal Islamic Republic. And I would be remiss if I didn't mention Qatar and Turkey, who are somehow the honest brokers in the return of those that were abducted, and the understanding that if genocide has been appropriated, that term, in order to seat the Jew among nations, Dreyfus, on the docket of the accused in none other than an international court of justice, a court of last resort, to defend itself of that accusation, blood libel, that has been, of course, redefined by Amnesty International and then requoted by universities and, of course, senior UN officials, to defend itself of that blood libel, even as it is actually fighting for its life from openly declared genocidal intent. And so what we have to do is, first of all, reclaim the understandings and the definitions and the law and the institutions and the terminology. They have meaning. It's not Zionism that's racism, it's anti-Zionism that's racism. And I implore each individual here to begin saying, I'm a Zionist. Why am I a Zionist? Because I believe in the right of self-determination for the Jewish people. That's all it means to be a Zionist, because our ancestors and yours prayed and yearned and longed for Jews to be able to return to Zion. I am a Zionist. The understanding that if we will be able to reclaim that, and as I say, with regards to the IRA working definition, hold spaces and places to account, because more than 40 countries and more than 1,200 entities, and in my previous role, 35 special envoys for combating anti-Semitism, recommitted in global guidelines for combating anti-Semitism to use the IRA working definition. Hold spaces and places to account. Anti-Semitism has a definition. It's only that definition that will enable to identify all of its strains. And when you have an ever-mutating virus, if you allow the modern strain to infect our spaces and places, anti-Zionism as that modern strain, then of course the old lethal strains are also unleashed and normalized. Look,
Michal, I want to
just
interrupt you for 1 second.
yeah.
Because I do want to jump to Itamar, actually piggyback on what you're saying, because I think it's very important that we actually have a room full of journalists that need to talk about how the language that we use. So Itamar, I mean, it has morphed a lot, the whole ideology, the whole language around anti-Semitism, as Michal is implying. Talk to the journalists about what they need to watch for in order to make sure that they're themselves using the right language and recognize anti-Semitism in the contents that they're reading or interviewing.
Okay, so there's a whole separate Palestinian Authority language, for example, that has different meanings to the Palestinians internally and has different meanings internationally. And of course, we just hear about the genocide, but I'll start with something else that's so fundamental to understanding the conflict, and that's the word occupation. The word occupation to the journalists around the world and to most Europeans means the Jews living, or Israel controlling, Judea and Samaria, Gaza Strip and Jerusalem. That's occupation. In the Palestinian Authority, occupation means all of Israel, without a doubt. They, in fact, in the last few years, they have stopped using the word Israel. The occupation had meetings with so-and-so. The occupation, that's the term that they use in place of the term Israel. It's one of the most fundamental messages. And we've seen something else, and this is so critical for what's happening around the world. All of these hate terms that I've been talking about and that we see now around the world, the Palestinian Authority has been disseminating for years. We have been warning about these for decades before any overt anti-Semitism was present around the world. And during this entire period, we're watching the Palestinian Authority telling its people through its official media about the programs that they're starting around the world. They literally described the tentacles. They had a program, they still have a program, from the capitals of the world. It's on once a week. And they'd interview their people in different countries. Well, we've done this, we've done that, we've organized this, we've done that. They literally, what's happening around the world is because the world ignored the Palestinian Authority anti-Semitism, and they ignored their attempts to disseminate it. And the result today is that all of these ideologies that I talked about before, the Jews, the enemy of humanity, that's what we're hearing around the world. We heard it from the Nazis. The Palestinian authorities normalized it amongst their own people, and now we're hearing it around the world as well. So what we have to do is, to stop all of this, we have to really eliminate it at the core. We have to eliminate Palestinian Authority anti-Semitism, because that is the oil that is leaking out to the flames around the world. It has to be stopped at the source.
Thank you, Itamar. Now we're going to have to wrap up because we're going to want to have some coffee. So I'm just going to ask one more question that is going to go to Rowan and to Michal, and it is a 60-second answer that I want from each of you. If you were speaking to a young Arab or a Muslim who has grown up with these anti-Semitic narratives, or even to a young American or a Canadian, in your case, Michal, and you had 60 seconds, really just 60 seconds, to persuade them to question those narratives, what would you say? Rowan, you start.
In 60 seconds, I'm going to say what I said at the Human Rights Council in the UN in Geneva. I'll ask every Arab to be a better Arab, a better Muslim. It's embarrassing to be called an Arab nowadays, and I say this even on Arab television, when people call me an Arab Zionist, I have no problem at all. I'm proud to be a Zionist, but I have a big problem being an Arab because of the damage they've done. And when people get offended, ask them, especially Arabs, if you are in America or in Europe and somebody shouts Allahu Akbar near you, what would you do? You run for your life. So that expression, meaning God is great, has become associated with terrorism. You refuse that, you protest it, be better, and ask of all of your friends and family members to be better. It is shaming the fact that all the Arabs have contributed to human civilization in the past century at least, is pulling us backwards and trying to take us back to the 7th century. It shouldn't be something we discuss. Unfortunately, it is as simple as that.
Thank you so much, Michal.
Thank you. Look, just to continue exactly Rowan's important words, it's about hope. Are we giving the future generations hope? And when you gaze backwards and you fill with glorification of murder and hate and death, what you are denying is hope for a better future for that next generation. The understanding of what the Abraham Accords potentially, and I was a member of Knesset then at the time when we signed them, the Abraham Accords potentially flipped the paradigm of rejection to normalization by doing something pivotal with the 3 no's of Khartoum. No to recognition of Israel, no to negotiation with Israel, and no to peace with Israel. In actually creating the opportunity for the 3 yeses, recognition of each other's right to exist, that enables the negotiation of our coexistence, that can ultimately pave path to peace for all peoples of this region and beyond it. That is the notion of hope. But I will quote the late Rabbi Sachs and his differentiation on that notion of what hope means, and it's also a message to each and every one of you. And he differentiates between optimism and hope, saying that optimism is the belief that everything will be okay, whereas hope is the belief that together we can make it okay. In that sense, optimism is a very passive virtue, and hope is a very active one. And it takes not very much courage to be an optimist, but a great deal of courage to have hope. And I will speak as a member of my people, a prototypical indigenous people that has not only carried hope, but has been carried by hope for thousands of years of our existence, as we sit in its eternal capital, of which the national anthem is Hatikva, the hope that requires each of us for action and courage, including those youngsters anywhere in the world. Thank you.
Well, it is a long morning, but I have to say that Nitzan and the whole team of the GPO could not have found us more appropriate and inspiring panelists. So thank you, Rowan, Itamar, and Michal for being here.